What is going on, guys? It's me here back with another First Descendant video, and today is a special one. We're going to be going over Ultimate Freyna finally, and I have 6 builds in total for you guys. There's going to be a lot of mobbing builds, 4 to be exact, and then we're going to go over 2 different bossing builds. Now, a quick overview of Freyna, in my opinion, is that she is absolutely insane for mobbing, especially the new 400% dungeons, obviously, but she works pretty much anywhere when it comes to mobbing. For bossing, she is actually very good at blowing up the squishier bosses. As far as the tankier bosses, I would say she's a bit on the weaker side. I would definitely use a lot of other descendants before I actually use her for that purpose. Those bosses would be like Gluttony and the new Deathstalker boss as well. But I do have a build that I will go over with you guys. It's just a build that requires quite a bit of management in terms of managing stacks on the boss to actually make it effective. Whereas you could just pull out like a Haley or an Enzo or something like that and do more damage with a lot less effort. I will go over that with you guys, but I would generally recommend using other descendants for that. However, for mobbing and for blowing up squishier bosses, she is absolutely insane. I would say she debatably has dethroned Bunny in terms of mobbing, and the best part of all, I'm sure you guys already know this, is that she's just incredibly fun to play. So with that all out of the way, let's not waste any more time and get right into these builds. And for our first build, we're going to be going over 2 different Contagion builds. Now, I'm sure a lot of you guys are familiar with this mod, but for those of you who are not, essentially what this does is makes it so whenever you kill something with Freyna, when it has Toxic applied to it, it's going to spread pools of Toxic all around it. Essentially, this makes it so your Toxic spreads like the plague across the entire map very quickly and does a ton of damage and just kills everything. This, in my opinion, is the absolute best mobbing module, and there's a couple different ways you can build it. This is the module that I would say puts Freyna at least on a tier with Bunny in terms of mobbing, if not even higher up, and it's extremely strong for basically all mobbing content. This is going to be the standard setup, and then I will get into a variant setup after that. So for our base survivability, we are going to be taking increased HP. I found that this is enough in terms of survivability because everything is pretty much dead before it can even look at you. However, if you do need to flex in additional survivability, you can add a polarity, but I've found that this is plenty of survivability along with your components. I would actually recommend, if you do want to add survivability, to do that through your components instead of your modules here. Now, for our damage mods, we are now in a meta where crit is very bad for a lot of descendants. There is a select few that still use crit. However, a lot of descendants just use flat damage now because of these new modules. So going over the modules for damage here, we have our focus on Toxic and our focus on Tech. Obviously, these are going to give us cooldown. We want to get these cooldowns as low as possible, and that is because we can spam the poison all over the place, but it's also going to pair really well with our main weapon if you have it, which is going to be the Secret Garden, which I will go over a little bit later in the video. Then on top of this, we're going to want to take Toxic Amplification as well as Tech Amplification, and that is because Contagion Links is actually a tech ability as well, so Toxic Tech, and this is what's going to be doing the damage here. And the percentages on all our abilities are actually about at the threshold where you kind of want to prioritize skill power over modifier, but we can take both and still get good value because the percentages are not so high that it's making the value really bad, like with Haley with a 3000% modifier, for instance. Now, additionally, to get our cooldown further down, we're going to be taking Nimble Fingers and MP Conversion. Again, we want to spam as much as possible, and then we'll be taking MP Collector to kind of help keep our mana up as much as possible while we're spamming abilities because Freyna is quite mana hungry. However, I've found that MP Collector has been plenty enough to actually keep my mana up. But again, if you are having mana issues, you could drop some cooldown or you could repolarize one of your damage modules. I would definitely get rid of Tech Amplification first if you do have to take off a damage module, and then you could put Maximize Conservation there if you would like to lower your mana costs. Now, the last very important thing on Freyna is going to be a range, and her max expandable range on her abilities is 300%. We have a base of 100%, so essentially what we want to do is get an additional 200%. So we're going to be taking a skill expansion and maximize range. This gets us to almost the max here. We're sitting at about 290% range with these 2 modules, and that is really it for the Contagion build. Very simple, very easy to build out. I am going to be going over Reactor and components, but I'm going to be doing that all together after after I go over all 4 of the mobbing setups, because the reactor and the components pretty much work for all of them, and there's a lot of flexibility there. So we'll go over that after we get through the mobbing setups here. And here is the second Contagion build, and this one is completely different. It's kind of a meme build, but it also works really well. I like to call this one the go AFK and make a sandwich build. And essentially what this does is lets you stand there AFK. Everything is going to just die by hitting you, and you will just keep regenerating your health back. It is really fun to use. It's definitely a meme build, but actually still really strong. Now, one quick note about this is I did mess up my polarities a bit. So if you want the most amount of damage possible, rather than have focus on tech here and having a cerulean slot here, put your cerulean polarity where focus on tech is, and then put toxic amplification here in your rutile slot. That will give you more damage than having the focus on tech. Now, only a couple small changes here, and again, it only requires one polarity change, which is going to be this cerulean slot here. You are going to be taking HP amplification, and this is just so you have more survivability, because there is going to be a lot of things hitting you and trying to kill you. So you are going to want some more HP so that you don't die. And then we are changing MP collector to HP collector, and because this is based on your max HP, having a lot of max HP is going to make this more valuable, and this is what's going to keep you alive mainly. Now, on top of this, I did just drop the cooldown mods here and throw in time distribution and agony just for a little more survivability. This isn't an absolute must, but it does help some with staying alive. So if you are having trouble staying alive, you could throw these 2 modules in. Otherwise, you can keep the cooldown if you really want to, so that you can throw your other abilities around more often. And then we just throw in an outstanding investment that is going to give us more skill duration on the armor itself, so that we basically have 100% uptime on that, and we just take the polarity off of there, and then it fits in perfectly, assuming you have maxed out your contagion here. Now, if you do want to throw in additional polarities, you could put a rutile here as well, and then throw in skill extension, for instance. But this is a nice and budget friendly way to do it without spending more catalysts, and I've found that this is plenty enough to clear all the current content in the game with this build. Now, before I get into the other 2 mobbing builds here, I do want to point out that these do not work as well as Contagion does, just to put that out there, but they offer a different play style that I think is very fun. And I do think Venom synthesis actually can be used for certain situations and make it better than Contagion, where you're kind of doing more of a hit and run style approach to your mobbing setup. So if you're running circles around something, you could use a Venom synthesis, for instance, like a Valby farm type farm. That would be a really good use of this, as well as if you're running a mission where you're just doing circles, like the Echo Swamp mission that a lot of people run on Bunny, you could use this as well, and that would probably be really good. And essentially what Venom synthesis does is turns our 3 ability into something that leaves toxic pools behind. Now, it doesn't say that it actually benefits from range on the toxic footprint, but it actually does, and it makes the toxic footprint a lot bigger. So we do keep range on our build. Everything else is pretty much very similar to the Contagion build, but we are taking Decimator here rather than MP collector, and that is because we are not spamming as much. We don't have nearly as much cooldown. We still do have a lot of cooldown, enough to keep 100% uptime on our Venom synthesis, but it's not nearly as much. So you should find that your mana is okay, and we're also not using MP conversion, which also takes away from our max mana pool. This should be fine. If you do have issues with mana, however, you can take Decimator off and put MP collector there if you would like. But yeah, everything else is pretty much exactly the same as the Contagion build. All right, and the last build we have here is Toxic Stimulation. Now, I don't actually think this Transcendent mod is very good at all, but it is kind of funny to use sometimes. Essentially what this does is applies your armor with your 2 to your teammates in a radius around you. So if they run in and get hit, it's going to start applying poison to all the enemies that are hitting them. So if your team is like spreading out a lot, it can be nice as a way to get your poison all over the place, but I haven't really found a practical use for it. It is, again, pretty fun to use. You just buff your teammates and kind of stand there and watch them run in and poison everything and watch everything die, but it doesn't really compare to like Contagion or Venom synthesis in my opinion. But here is a sample build for for this if you do want to try it out. Now, obviously, the polarities are not perfect here. You do need to keep in mind that this is a dimension ability, so focus on dimension rather than focus on tech is a good choice here. And then you can also keep toxic amplification, so you have 3 of your 4 damage mods. Now, if you want to use additional polarities, you could polarize and then throw in dimension amplification as well, but I didn't really want to min-max this one because I found it kind of underwhelming overall. Now, this does also give your teammates a small defense buff, but I don't really think it's enough to justify using it anywhere. If this was like an HP buff, then it may be actually worth using, but because it is just a defense buff, again, I didn't really find it too great. And just one thing to keep in mind is that your actual Contagion links is a tech ability, so once something actually dies from this poison tick here, the poison that gets dropped on the ground is going to be tech, so there is a mismatch in types here as well, which actually makes the damage on your pools that fall on the ground do a lot less. So you can also slot in a focus on tech if you want to, and tech amplification. However, the initial poisons are going to do less, but the pools on the ground are going to do more. But this is another reason why I didn't really love this Transcendent module, is because of the mismatch in types here. But again, here's a kind of blueprint if you do want to try this one out. And that concludes the mobbing setups for Freyna here. Now, there is a lot of flexibility here. Obviously, you can put in more survivability if you want. You can put in duration if you want and drop some of the damage. That's really up to you. You will have to repolarize some things, but I feel that a lot of people have kind of built up a lot of catalysts now and understand that system enough to where you guys can make those decisions on yourself. However, I found that this build here and these mods here have been the most effective for me, especially because in the 400% dungeons, they have a lot of resist to ability damage. So stacking up as much of that damage as possible actually does end up making a difference now. So I've gone for more of the damage cooldown side of things, but again, you could drop some, put some duration, put some more survivability, whatever really suits you. But this is kind of supposed to be a blueprint for you guys to use these. Now, in just about every single case possible in terms of mobbing with Freyna, you are going to want to be using the Secret Garden, and that is because of the passive here, Pest Control. Essentially, when you are spamming your 1 and your 3 ability, you are getting stacks that increase your firearm attack, but also the more important thing is your skill power. It's going to increase it by a total of, I believe it's 37%. So the first stack is actually only 5%. The additional stacks are 16 each, so it equals out to 37% extra skill power, and these last for 10 seconds. So as long as your 1 and 3 ability are below a 10-second cooldown, you can pretty much keep this up most of the time. Now, it is a 50% trigger rate, but if you're spamming them enough, it's going to be up most of the time. And with Freyna, you're not really using her for gun damage, and if you do need to do gun damage, for instance on a boss or something, you can use your ultimate ability, which is really good for melting the bosses in the 400% dungeons right now, because they take a lot more damage from ability damage than they do from gun damage. Or you could swap to like an Enduring Legacy and just shoot the boss. But I would definitely say get your hands on the Secret Garden if you have not already. I have a build video for that, so if you aren't really sure where to start out with building this thing out, you can check that video out. I would also recommend maxing the copies on this gun. It is going to help a lot with the trigger rates and the stacks and damage. Now, it is a bit of a rough farm, but it is 100% worth it if you plan to use Freyna a lot for mobbing. And real quick, for those of you who don't want to hop over to the video and watch the full guide on the Secret Garden, here is the mobbing build that I'm using for it right now. So if you guys just want to screenshot that and copy it, or just have reference, here it is. And this Freyna tab here, you can ignore that. Now let's quickly get into the Reactor. For your Reactor, you are going to want a toxic tech reactor. However, if you are again using the toxic stimulation, then you may opt for a toxic dimension one. But if you want kind of a universal reactor, just go with a toxic tech. And as for your mounting, again, if you are using anything to do with contagion or venom synthesis, I would definitely recommend getting Secret Garden as your mounting, because that is going to let you use Secret Garden to get those extra skill power stacks. However, if you're using toxic stimulation, that ability is actually type dimension, so you're not benefiting from the Secret Garden, so you could use whatever gun you really want. As long as the mounting is matching, you're good to go. And then for the substats themselves, there is so many different combinations that you can use. They are pretty much universal to all the mobbing setups. One you see here is just a lower cooldown and higher duration. That is going to be good for every single mobbing setup. You could also go for something like toxic damage and tech damage to just have your poison stacks do more damage. Range is also good here because you you are missing a little bit of range from your modules. So if you do get range on the reactor itself, you will actually cap out at that 300%. Skill costs can also be good if you are having mana issues. The only things I would avoid is things like crit, because we are not using crit. You do not want to invest in crit on Freyna because she does not scale very well with it. And because this is a mobbing setup, you don't really want Colossus damage on the reactor itself. So again, any base damage type that is toxic or tech, cooldown, duration, skill cost, skill range, all those are great choices. Now for your component set, there is a couple different options here. However, I typically like to just stick to the Slayer set, and that is because it gives me enough tankiness to actually do the content while also giving a huge damage boost and just the extra rounds per magazine. Now it does make your abilities cost more mana, so if you are having mana issues while using this, you could obviously just swap off of it. But I've found that this gives me plenty of survivability, and especially because most mobs are not touching you because they are dying before they can, I like using the Slayer set, but there is some other options as well. So if you are looking for a tankier option that still gives you a little bit of extra damage, as well as in this case extra duration, you could do the double annihilation set and the double venom set. This gives you 6% toxic skill power, so you do get some of that extra damage, and then you also get some extra skill duration. So this is also a good setup. I would definitely do a auxiliary power and memory for the annihilation, and a sensor and a processor for the venom. And then building off of this, you can also do a 4-piece venom setup here, and this makes it so you get skill power modifier up to 10 stacks, so it will cap out at 7% if you have max stacks, and it also gives you some extra firearm attack. Now this overall is not as good as the Slayer set in terms of damage, and as far as survivability, it is just about the same, so I wouldn't really recommend using the 4 set here. I would just do the 4 set Slayer, but if you are having mana issues with the 4 set Slayer, you could do this instead, and that would be perfectly fine. Again, this is for mobbing, so we don't have to completely min-max every single little thing. And then quickly going over the substats on the components themselves that you'll want regardless of whatever set you're using. On your auxiliary power, you're going to want HP and MP recovery out of combat. On your sensor, you're going to want max MP and MP recovery in combat. This is the most important piece right here. On your memory, you're going to want defense, and then ideally you're also going to want to get MP recovery modifier. That is going to make your passive regen a little bit higher, as well as the mana drops that mobs give. That will also give you a little extra mana back. And then for your processor, you really just want the max shield roll. The other roll in terms of mobbing doesn't really matter too much. You could just do toxin resistance, you could have drop rate for equipment, whatever you really want there is fine. And real quickly, those of you wondering about the distorted resolve set, this set is actually just pretty much worse in every way than the Slayer set when it comes to both mobbing and bossing. So I would actually avoid using this altogether and just go with the Slayer set if you are going with a skill damage based build, regardless if it is mobbing or bossing. So just to address that in case you are wondering. And the first bossing setup we're going to talk about here is based around our toxic mixture module. And essentially what this does is, rather than inflicting room 0 trauma with our abilities, we are now applying necrosis stacks to whatever we are hitting. So this is really good for use on bosses, assuming you can obviously get to 100 stacks, which is the max, and then hold 100 stacks. You'll be getting 90% extra firearm attack damage, which you can see here. Not only this, but you will also get extra firearm critical hit rate, and the boss will have less resistance to your critical hits. So it is pretty nice, but getting to 100 stacks and maintaining it can be pretty annoying. And honestly, even while at 100 stacks, I found that this just does not do nearly as much damage as like a Glay or an Enzo or a Gun Haley. But if you really want to play Freyna in bossing, and specifically for tankier bosses like Gluttony and Deathstalker, then you can use this build here. There is a better setup if you're doing boss burning, so the squishier bosses that you can kind of just blow up, which is the next build we'll get into. But just to go over this build here, we are going to be taking 2 HP mods, and that is because we are again building this out for the tankier, stronger bosses that are going to be hitting a lot harder. For this spot here, it's kind of a flex, so if you're doing, say, Deathstalker, you'll want perfect anti-venom. If you're doing Gluttony, you'll obviously want anti-free solution, so you kind of match that to whatever you need here. here. Then we are also going to take increased defense, again, because these bosses hit very hard. Increased defense does help a lot. Now, these bosses essentially have a split of damage. Deathstalker, for instance, does toxic and firearm damage with each attack. The defense that you have will mitigate the firearm half of the damage itself. So you do want to have defense. It's still going to help you stay alive here. Then going through the rest of the modules, we're going to be taking MP conversion. This is going to let us have a low cooldown so that we can keep our stacks up more often. We do need cooldown to actually be able to have 100% uptime. And essentially what I do is just use my 1 ability to keep the stacks going. It is the lowest MP cost. If you look at our 3 ability, it costs a little bit more MP. So I like to just use this, and we're not building ability damage whatsoever. So you're not trying to do damage. So you can just use your 1 to keep your stacks going. Then we're also going to be stacking up on duration with maximized duration and skill extension. This just makes it a lot easier to keep the stacks going. So if we look here right now, my duration on my stacks is 9.3 seconds rather than 5 seconds. So that is just going to be a lot easier to maintain. Then I've also taken maximize conservation and strong mentality to reduce the skill cost, because we're going to have to be using this pretty much on cooldown to keep the stacks going. So you want to make sure you have as much mana as possible. And Ultimate Freyna's base mana is actually not super high. So the skill cost is going to be important here. And then lastly, because this is a gun focused build, essentially we're just maintaining our stacks and then shooting the boss. The last mod we'll take here is going to be shot focus for that extra firearm attack. And the way you want to play this build is at the beginning of the boss fight, you're going to pop your ultimate, shoot the boss as many times as you can with that, and build up as many stacks as possible with whatever gun you're using. Now, if you have extra magazine size on the gun itself, it's going to let you shoot more bullets in your ultimate, which I'll be covering more in depth in the build we're going to be going over after this. But essentially, get as many stacks from your ultimate on the boss as you can. Then immediately when your ultimate is done, you want to throw a Q to have your stacks start building and maintaining themselves, and then shoot the boss while doing so. Now, this is going to work a lot better with a gun that doesn't have to be held down all the time. So Enduring Legacy is actually not super great for this one, but something like a Greg's Reverse Fate, for instance, you can kind of shoot, throw your 1 ability out to get your stacks going, shoot, rather than having to rely on like sharp precision shot or mental focus. But from my personal experience, I have run this quite a lot of times to try to make it feel better, and I just really didn't enjoy using this build very much. So it's not something I will personally be running. And the other reason I don't really love using Freyna for these tankier bosses is because her poison dots actually do build up the enrage meter very quickly, leading to faster immunity phases with less damage. It makes burning the boss a lot harder, and it also takes away from damage that could be going towards like a boss's weak points to be able to grapple those and such. But if you guys do like using Freyna for bossing, I would definitely recommend going with the toxic mixture setup for the tankier bosses, because once you get good at maintaining those stacks on the boss itself, you will actually do a lot of damage. For this particular build, because this is a gun focused build, the reactor does not really matter. You're not doing much skill damage at all to where it would matter whatsoever. So you can kind of take a couple different things here, but I would definitely just recommend taking a reactor of any kind that has substats of skill duration up, and then you could either take skill cooldown or something like skill cost. Also, skill effect range would not be bad, because it will make your toxic pools a little bit larger on the ground so that the boss will not move out of them as often. But I like just taking the skill duration and the skill cooldown. For your components, you have 2 choices here. One is just going with a 4-piece annihilation set, so you will get a little bit of that extra duration on your stacks, but you will also get obviously extra firearm attack if you are missing HP. And again, the substats you want on here is going to be exactly the same as the ones for the mobbing setup. Now, the other way that you can build your components is to simply just build as tanky as possible. And typically the way to do that I recommend is building something like this, where you just have a lot of HP. About 23k is pretty good, and then around 16k defense is also good. So you can see I just have this and this. We're not really worried about the set effect. We're just trying to get the HP and stats out of these. And then you can also keep your 2-piece annihilation here for a little bit of that extra skill duration as well. All right, guys, and the last build we're going to be going over is a Venom Injection, and this is amazing for boss burning. This will let you wipe out bosses 1 through 4. You will nuke them in like 5 to 10 seconds. And essentially what Venom Injection does is makes it so our 2 ability gives us a bunch bunch of stat boosts. So you can see here we get extra skill power, we get toxin resistance, which we're not really using it for. It does also give us some shield recovery per second. And then if we do attack an enemy while this buff is active, they have their toxic resistance reduced. So we'll just do a lot more skill damage to them overall when using this. And essentially this build is built around our Venom Baptism, which is our 4 ability, our unique weapon. We're going to try to get as much damage into that as possible, which the modules are very important, but also our weapon is very important. So going over the modules here, this is a toxic tech ability. So for our damage, we're going to be taking Tech Specialist and Toxic Specialist. Now we're not worried about cooldown here because this is again meant to just one phase a boss. So we are only going to be using our ultimate once, hopefully. On top of that, we're going to be taking the Toxic Amplification and the Tech Amplification mods. Now additional damage mods, this is going to be Dangerous Ambush. This is going to make it so we do a lot more damage to the boss when it actually falls to the floor. This build will make all the bosses fall to the floor before they go into immunity phase. Once they actually hit the floor, you're going to be doing a ton more damage with the Venom Baptism. And we're also going to take Venom Syncytium for the extra 10% skill power and Spear and Shield for the extra 8% skill power. And you do want to take Spear and Shield here because if you do look at the actual percentage on the unique weapon, it's almost 800%, which means skill power is much better than modifier. Make sure you're taking Spear and Shield and not Iron Defense. And I also have Strong Mentality on here just so it drains our mana a little bit slower. This isn't a must-have because again, you're just one phasing a boss. So you could really put whatever you want here. If you want like some extra cooldown in case you're doing Swamp Walker and it goes into immunity, you could throw that here. And then the last modules we're going to take is just Increased Shield and Overwhelming Shield. This is going to make it so we don't get literally one tapped by the boss while we're walking up to it or something like that. And these two modules will do plenty to keep us alive until the boss is actually on the floor and eventually dead. Now for your reactor, ideally you want this to be on a decent weapon in cases like where you're doing Swamp Walker and it ends up not dying from your ultimate, so you have an actual decent weapon without having to swap. However, again, you could just swap weapons after your ultimate's done if you need to, so it doesn't really matter too much here. As long as you have a toxic tech reactor, you'll be good to go. Just make sure it's matching whatever weapon you have out when you actually use your Venom Baptism. Now for the substats themselves, you are going to want Colossus damage. That is going to give you the biggest bang for your buck in terms of the actual damage on the ability. Now the other thing you're going to want here is going to be either toxic or tech skill power boost ratio. We don't want crit because again, Freyna, we're not building for crit, so you are going to want one of the actual flat damage boost ratios. Tech is going to come out a little bit ahead of toxic, but if you get either one, I would definitely just settle for that, but just make sure you get the Colossus damage at the very least. That is the most important part. And then for your component set, you are going to want the Slayer set, no debate at all. That is because one, it's going to make you just hit a lot harder with your Venom Baptism, but two, the rounds per magazine that you see on this set actually makes it so you have more bullets in your Venom Baptism itself. Now I was talking before about how the gun actually affects the actual amount of shots you have in your Venom Baptisms, and again, you want the same substats across these. And you can see here I have almost 5k shield, so it is actually enough to keep me alive during a boss while still being able to burn it, and 18k defense. All right, now quickly getting into your weapon, it is very much up to you what weapon you want to use, but there is a couple must-have mods for this build, and these are the mods right here. You are going to want Fire Rate Up, Compulsive Magazine, which gives the most rounds per magazine of any of the purple mods, and we're not worried about weak point because our Venom Baptism does not do weak point damage, and then Expand Weapon Charge. Now the reason we take Sharp Precision Shot is so that we don't have to build any sort of duration on Freyna, and that gives us more module capacity by not having to do that, and this lets us dump the entire mag before the duration runs out, even with the max mag size, which I think is 93 or 94. The last thing you're going to want on your gun, which I actually don't have here, is a rounds per magazine roll. That will also affect the amount of rounds in your magazine for the Venom Baptism, and those are the only stats that actually affect Venom Baptism, is the fire rate and then the rounds per magazine. So you want to make sure you have these 4 mods. Outside of this, whatever you can put here to get as much damage as possible, or you can just use this weapon as a means to use the ultimate, and then once your ultimate is done, you can then swap to whatever weapon you want to use and then swap back to this when you want to use your ultimate again. This is built for just one phasing the squishier bosses, so you really shouldn't have to do that. And one last question you may have is, why not just use the Secret Garden and, you know, build up your stacks and then use Venom Baptism Baptism after that to get the most damage. And that is just because when you do use Venom Baptism, it gets rid of those stacks. So it doesn't really actually do anything. It does not carry over to the unique weapon. So there's no point in really doing that. Anyways, guys, that is going to do it for this one. I just love this character so much that I was playing around with pretty much everything. And again, you can flex modules around. This is hopefully just something you see as like a blueprint that you can change around and modify to fit what you want to play. Thank you guys so much for watching. I really appreciate it. Shout out to my supporters on Patreon, as well as the Nexon Creator Program, and shout out to my subscribers on Twitch. I will leave links to all that stuff in the description below. And a quick important note about the Nexon Creator Program is your support for your creators actually expires, I think, after 2 or 3 months. Now, I don't know if they actually inform you of this, but a lot of my previous supporters have actually expired. So if you guys were previously supporting me and aren't sure if you still are registered and would like to check that, you can just revisit the link and see if you are still supporting. I would greatly appreciate it. If you did expire, if you guys were able to resupport, you'll notice a lot of the creators have dropped off in terms of supporters, and that is because that reason they expire. And lastly, if you guys aren't in the Discord, I do have a link to that in the description below as well. Feel free to come join. We hang out, we talk. There's a lot of great players that are willing to help out and carry. There's build discussions, all kinds of fun stuff in there. So that is going to do it for this one. And for those of you waiting for Ajax, I apologize once again. I really just got super addicted to playing Freyna, but Ajax builds are completely done, and he's actually really good for the new Colossus. So that is going to be the next Descendant, which I should have out pretty soon here. I appreciate y'all's patience so much on that one. I'm going to stop yapping now. I will catch y'all in the next one.